Well, for marriage in particular, I think the couple tax allowance would be right at the top of the list because I just think marriage itself is key to so much else, and incentivizing people to get married and stay married financially has so many benefits to children in particular and to society more widely. So I think I would put that right at the top.
Dr. Michael Schluter, what a privilege to talk to you. Welcome to the Coalition for Marriage podcast. Now, the reason I really wanted to talk to you is because you've had a history of creating organizations, creating a few different organizations, writing an awful lot of material, and really driven by what's called your relational worldview. And I wonder if we could start off, perhaps you could give me a little potted history, your relational worldview, what it means vis-a-vis marriage would be interesting because that's our key focus, of course, but also maybe just give us a little brief history of what you've done, the organizations you've set up, and then we'll maybe pick up on some of those bits as we go along.
So originally, when I came back to Britain from Africa, I set up Jubilee Centre and very quickly got drawn into the Keep Sunday Special campaign. So I ran this campaign against Mrs. Thatcher back in the 1980s. Seems a long time ago now, but it was on the issue of why we should keep one day shops closed. What are the benefits of that? And of course, the benefits are that families can spend time together. Back in the day, everybody pretty much had a Sunday lunch of some sort. Today, 25% of people don't even have a table in the house around which the family members can gather. So, but the importance of the family lunch on a Sunday was that people talked, and it's conversations that build community. And it's I have a saying that time is the currency of relationships. So time, or we developed that as the concept of chronomics, a science of how you measure and utilize time, is critical to how relationships get built. That led on to material ultimately summarized in a book called The Relational Lens, published by Cambridge University Press, no less, which argued that there are 5 different ways in which you build close relationships, whether that's in a marriage or a family context, or whether it's outside that in a school or a business context or wherever. But there are those 5 aspects that underpin every relationship. And they are the extent to which people meet and talk face to face rather than simply on the phone or emails. Secondly, the continuity over time, that you don't get to know another person really well unless you've seen them in different circumstances in different periods of time. Multiplexity is the third one, which is sort of many-sidedness, whether you've met people not just on a football pitch or a tennis court or wherever, but at work, at home, in the community, at church, wherever. But if you see them in other contexts, you get other aspects of their personalities. You see what they're really like. And then fourthly, whether people treat each other with respecting their dignity and respecting them as equals in some sense. If people are not connecting as equals, then they won't be open with each other. And finally, the issue of whether people can identify common values and common purpose. So all of those things impact on how much relational proximity there is. We use this term relational proximity, and that then determines how well they know each other and how they respond to each other. So there's a whole background of work there, which is all connected with how you build a marriage, how you build strong family relationships and strong community relationships.
Tell us more about the organizations you've so it wasn't just the Jubilee Centre, you've done more than that, and significantly more than that. Not that was nothing, that's very, very significant, but you've done more than that. And also your work goes beyond the familial relationships and into the corporate world as well, and says, well, actually, relationships should be more important per se in wider society.
Yes, that's right. The work does go a lot wider than families. It does go into the education system. So we set up an organization called Relational Schools. in the UK. It was quite small here, but then my colleague went off to Australia and set it up on an enormous basis in Australia. So relational schools had a huge impact, but on the other side of the planet. And then we looked at relational companies. How do you strengthen relationships among the major corporate stakeholders that are shareholders, employees, customers, and suppliers?
Right.
And of course, that links with the local community. How does the company build all of those relationships? Has been a big chunk of work.
Yeah.
And then just this analysis of what does a strong relationship mean, and then how do you apply that in the daily life of the individual? So, wrote a book originally, The R Factor, and then a second book called The R Option, with a close colleague, David John Lee, who sadly died of cancer a few years back. But in that book, The R Option, we look at how this applies across every part of life. Why is forgiveness so important, not and particularly in families, actually? Because if you don't forgive, then there's this barrier that exists between you, which impedes the development of strong relationships. To my embarrassment, I remember I had a lovely sister who since died, but for years the relationship was kind of blocked from becoming really close because she'd said something unhelpful about my son. And it sounds ridiculous looking back on it now, and I I feel so thoroughly embarrassed about it. But because of what she said then, I didn't really feel open to her or close to her anymore for those 10 years. And a huge loss to me. I hope something that lost to her too, but we did get over it eventually. But if you don't forgive, then it's really difficult to sustain close family relationships.
Yeah, and so much more so in a marriage. And my wife is so much better at that than I am. And whenever we go and do courses together, whenever my wife's there, it's so much richer.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yes, so much, and because people can talk to her in the breaks, and she's sat there nodding or shaking her head. But her attitude to forgiveness, and she's said this on many occasions. It's the key to a successful relationship. You've just got to let things go. And a lot of I would say most of our supporters are Christians. They're not all faiths and none, of course. A lot of them are Christians, and they will understand that forgiven greatly how I greatly love,
Yeah.
that if we've been forgiven so much, how dare we not forgive others?
Absolutely.
And so it's such and in a marriage, it really is the key to, I'm just going to, first of all, I'm going to forgive. Second, I'm going to interpret in a positive light. So I know you, and I know you love me, and I know you didn't do that to hurt me. So I'm not going to interpret it in my instinctive way.
Yes.
I'm going to interpret.
You're so right. You're so right, Tony.
Yeah, and that's so much in terms of we've lost that in society in terms of the relational worldview.
Yes.
We've kind of lost that. And your work, I love it because it brings that back. And for people who don't know, of course, we often quote the figure of the cost of family breakdown in the UK at 51 billion, which is around about the cost of our national defence budget. And that's in all sorts of costs in terms of social costs, educational costs, criminal justice system costs. When marriages break down, there are consequences, 51 billion. And that figure was come up with by the Relationship Foundation, which again is another Michael Schluter initiative. So thank you for that. It's very, very useful. It's a very objective, searing figure in terms of the consequences of relational worldviews breaking down. So well done there.
Well, I definitely want to give the credit for this, or share the credit with John Ashcroft in particular, but also other members of the team. They've done so much of the actual work. I've sort of blazed a trail, if you like, but it's the people who've come behind who actually put the flesh on the bones often, and provided the substantive outcomes that can be seen from the work, whether it's work on unemployment or international peace building or whatever it is. So there's been very much a whole team of people involved, and I've been lucky enough to be part of a fantastic team.
In terms of misinterpretation of relational worldview, an issue around identity politics is the term that's used, which is essentially that, you know, everyone can identify as whatever they want, and if you're really going to be kind, you need to accept that and treat people in the way that they want to be treated. A kind of a misinterpretation of, again, another scriptural principle of love your neighbor as yourself, if you like. Which, so how is that's not what you're saying, is it? What you're saying is fairly fundamentally different to that.
I think I would want to stress that we need to approach people who are, for example, gay and so on, um, in an attitude not of criticism but of love. It is very important, the starting point of discussion in this area, because particularly if we've had a very secure family background ourselves and we've had a very secure sense of our own identity, then it's very easy to get into a sort of critical and judgmental attitude towards people who've not had those advantages. So it's really important that we emphasize love in this context. On the other hand, it isn't helpful, I don't think, if we simply accept this as the new normal and move ahead without any regard as to what's driving these attitudes and struggles that people have, and how we can help people to realize the consequences if they decide to pursue, for example, sexual relationships in a gay context. What it does to them, what it does to the people around them, ultimately what it does to society. So it's a real challenge to get that balance right, I think. But I think the main thing is that if we are going to insist on what's right and wrong in a society, which is, I think, vital for its long-term health, we need to do it in a spirit of love and not sort of moral superiority.
Couldn't agree more. And there but for the grace of God go any of us, and you
Yeah,
know, absolutely right. So in schools, I mean, you spoke about the example in Australia, which was much more widely taken up than in the UK. If this were to be taken up in the UK, some would argue, well, we've kind of got it because you know, schools are very broadly accepting and are very liberal in terms of anything goes, etc., and you can be who you want to be, etc. How would you see anything taught in schools around a relationship or relational worldview differing from the current zeitgeist in the school arena?
I think it would be very helpful if schools could teach what we call relational literacy. That is, first of all, to understand how you form a deep relationship with another person. And I think you know probably that we have analyzed that process and published a book with Cambridge University Press on the subject called The Relational Lens. But we argue that you need to understand the dynamics of developing a deep relationship. It's about face-to-face contact. It's about continuity over a period of time. So there's no
Yeah,
instant deep relationship.
yeah,
It's about understanding a person from many different aspects of their interests and their personal goals and everything else around them. Where have they come from? What are their interests? What's the family background, etc. Understanding the importance of mutual respect. If you want an open conversation with somebody, there has to be mutual respect. Otherwise, somebody is going to distort what they're saying to please the other person, and you need a commonality of values and goals and purpose as well to underpin the relationship. So looking at those 5 areas is important to build close relationships with other people. We call it relational proximity. But also the way society operates determines the extent to which there is relational proximity between people. As you know, I spent a lot of my life fighting the issue of Sunday trading. You might think, well, what's that got to do with relationships? Isn't it about
mm, mm,
consumerism and all of that?
mm.
Which to some extent it is. But one of my favorite phrases is that time is the currency of relationship. We even developed a concept called chronomics, which is the study of time and how we use it. But time is key, and every business manager knows that the key decisions that are made in a business is who do you spend time with. because that determines often how the rest of the business functions and the success of the business. But time is the currency of relationships. So how do you protect time for families? How do you protect time for marriage? I remember when my kids were growing up, I had three teenage kids in the house at one point with my wife. And I mentioned that my wife is a counselor. And she suggested the idea that after supper every day, we should have half an hour, she and me, separate in another room away from the children, just to discuss what was going on in the family, and so that the kids could not drive a wedge between us, which they might want to do if they wanted to go out late at night. They'd say, well, I discussed it with mum. She said it was fine. So I think I ought to be able to do this. So we mustn't get into that situation where we disagree on those things.
I mean, that's a key principle that we can't let that go, because so many couples do not make time for themselves, and you've got to put your relationship first, sometime every single day, ideally once a week, then a longer period of time, which is just for you. And we find that it's not even being in the house together, because you've got to get away from, when you're in the house together, you're both doing different things. You might be sat next door to each other on a settee. One's watching the TV, one's on the laptop or something, doing some work. It's got to be dedicated time where we look each other in the face and we contact and we communicate about the things that we need to talk about.
Yes, there's a funny story of a man who in America. It's a true story. A man who comes, a very, very busy pastor. And the wife is getting fed up with the fact she never sees him because he's always out doing ministry. So one evening she leaves a note out on the table when he gets home late saying, a woman has been in touch. She needs some help and some time. Could you possibly go and meet her down at the local, whatever it was, McDonald's or wherever, so that you could just have a coffee and try and help her, please? So the pastor comes in, sees this on the table, and rushes off to McDonald's. There he finds his wife sitting at the table,
Oh, dearie me.
just because
Yeah,
that was the
yeah.
only way she could really get his attention. Another thought, just to share with you, while we're in this area of meal times in particular, which I think are so key. I remember when I was working at Jubilee House in Cambridge, I used to rush in from the office for supper with the kids at 7 o'clock. So these are three teenage kids sitting around the table with my wife and me. And I'd rush in at 1 minute to 7 and sit down, and then we would have our meal together. And I used to pat myself on the back. Look what a good father I am. I'm back by 7 o'clock for supper every night. I'm not one of these people who comes in late, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized one day that I hadn't given a single thought to what we would discuss around the dinner table. Would I go to a board meeting without ever reading the papers? Now, is a family mealtime more or less important than a company board meeting? But
Absolutely
I
right.
would argue actually that the family mealtime and the bringing up of my children has
Mm.
far greater long-term
Yeah, yeah,
consequences
yeah,
than any board
yeah,
meeting.
yeah,
Then why
yeah,
didn't I prepare for it? Why didn't I think about what we would
yeah,
discuss around the dinner table?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's one of the key things. In another talk I give around masculinity to men's groups is, what's your vision for your family? Without vision, the people perish, right? Where do you want to take it, and how are you going to do that? Or are you just going to let things float on? Two things come to mind from what you're saying. Firstly is our national obsession with GDP as the only measure of output, which drives everything, which is crazy. It doesn't matter whether people are happy or families are broken or successful. GDP is the only important thing. And then a book by Clayton Christensen called How Will You Measure Your Life? I can't remember whether he was Harvard or MIT, MBA professor. But his point was he was teaching captains of industry, and the whole story about he'd had a fatal diagnosis, which actually turned out not to be, but he wrote the book in the meantime. But his whole point was, look, you don't outsource the most meaningful thing. Don't spend all your life getting to a point where you can now relax, but your kids say, we don't want this. We wanted you along the road. We don't want the big houses each and the big cars now. If only we could have had you by our side at the dinner table. you know, and it's exactly what you're saying. And the book is, I would recommend anybody read that book. It takes corporate strategy and looks at it through the lens of human meaning. Very, very, very good book. Decades ago I read it, but it's absolutely fantastic. So in terms of then national policies. So we've got, I mean, I don't know, this isn't a party political comment, it's just an objective observation. In 3 years' time or so, we might have a very different government, or at least a very different opposition, the way things are looking. I know 3 years is a long time in politics, right? Anything could happen. Anything is happening, as it turns out. So things can change. But you may well have an administration who might be more receptive to this sort of thing. So in terms of policies, of course I would be concerned with the marriage aspect, but from your point of view, in terms of policies that an administration could implement that would drive a bit more of a relational society, what would you say would be your top two or three?
Well, I think you could require the government in the same way that they have a revenue impact assessment at the end of every bit of legislation. How will this impact on the revenue of each of the major government departments that are impacted by a regulation or a bill in Parliament? So what are the revenue implications? But why couldn't you have a family impact assessment, which was tried out, I believe, in Australia, where you look at, well, what is the impact going to be of this piece of legislation on the strength and welfare of families? So I think you could have some legislative requirement in that area. In terms of the tax issues, the couple tax allowance, which used to be there, I believe, at some point, which encouraged people to get married, because you didn't get the couple tax allowance unless you were married and cohabiting, indeed. But that couple tax allowance, even if it's only worth £500 a year, it actually does make a difference in people's thinking and in their decisions, I think, to realize that if they do simply tie the knot and become married formally, they're going to get an extra £500 between them. That is it's part of the decision-making process, but it does put a public marker down on the fact we value marriage and that marriage is good for you, and that all the evidence suggests, as I'm sure you know from the what's it called, Harry Benson runs it, the Marriage Coalition, Marriage Foundation, I think. They've done a lot of estimates to show that marriages, when marriages hold together, it's best for children, it's best for society in multiple ways. And then I think another interesting area is what they did in Singapore, where they said that if you live within, I think it's half a kilometer, it might be a kilometer, I don't remember exactly, of your elderly parents, you get a tax allowance for that too. Because obviously they're thinking in Singapore, wisely, I think, as the Singapore government so often does, they're very shrewd over there. I've been there lots of times, so I know all about this, that if you live within a certain distance of your elderly parents, you're likely to be able to save the state a huge amount of money. This elderly woman, man, needs certain medicine every day. They need to take it every day. Well, either a pharmacist has got to go out and make sure they take it because they forget or they've lost the prescription or whatever, or a relative needs to do that. If the relative's going to do it, they need to live very close because they're busy and, they're probably got children, etc. Their kids have got then their children. So if they're going to go and visit the elderly parents every day and make sure they're taking their medicine, they need to live very close. So incentivize them to live very close. Actually, it saves a huge amount of money on the government budget in the end.
Yeah, and it makes wider differences. I was had the privilege of doing some marriage courses in Vietnam not too long ago.
Yes,
some months ago, and it was really interesting because the question I hadn't prepared for was the mother-in-law, which was the predominant thing because they all live very close, either with or very close to earlier generations.
Yeah.
And as a consequence of that, their kids, although they have a higher percentage of women in work than we do, even married women in work, their children turn out so much better because they're looked after by those intergenerational parties, you know.
Relatives. Yeah.
The downside is the mother-in-law, which is a significant problem. But you know, not. I'm sure it can be dealt with. But it's quite interesting what you're saying. The kids are a lot happier. There wasn't. There wasn't really much in the way of state funding for elder care. That's the other side of it. So basically, if you don't look after your parents, no one else is going to. So
Yes, I
that
did a lot of
again,
work in South Korea where this is a huge issue because they've got a very sharply declining population, as we've
yep,
got a sharply
yep,
declining population, by
yep,
the way.
yep,
Why are people not having children is a really important question,
yep.
I think.
Let's
But
pause there. What's your view on that? Have you got a view on that? Sorry to ask you off the cuff.
why are people not having children?
And what can we do about it?
Well, I think it's partly a concern in the short term about cost. People are thinking, can we afford to have children? But of course, it's a time issue as well. Who's going to pick up the kids from school every day? Who's going to be at home when they come? You know, someone needs to be at home when they let out of school to receive them at home or collect them from school when they're young. So it's more about the time issues than it is about the money issues often. Um, and I think in South Korea, where people are working 70 hours a week, then it's very difficult to create the time. So
Yeah,
that's why the number of children per adult woman in Korea is about zero point 0.7 children per adult woman. It needs to be 2.1 just to keep a stable number in your country. But if you have it down at zero point 0.7, you're really wiping out a third of your population every 30 years or something, 40 years. And, you know, the population declines pretty sharply if you do that for a few generations. Um, so I think looking at the time issues for companies to look at the time issues and think about how many hours they're asking people to work and which hours, how much flexibility they're giving to women, particularly, etc. These are really critical issues to sustaining strong numbers of children and strong families.
it's a shame, and I don't know how we get back to a society where actually, if a mum wanted to stay at home and raise her little children, she could do. How you know an average guy on an average salary could sustain a house and a family. We're just not there, and I don't know how we get back there.
Well, we are in a strange situation that if you stay at home as a mother and look after your children, you get no recognition or tax benefit at all. If you go out to work and then you hire in help or you put your children into a nursery or something like that, you get a tax allowance for that. So we actually financially benefit people who do put their children out. And there was a case. There was a case in Ipswich or somewhere where two next door neighbours decided that um, they would each run a nursery on certain days a week. So one ran the nursery on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the other on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then the children would go to the neighbour. And then they got all the tax benefits from the government and everything else by just exchanging their children
Very
between the
clever.
two houses next door to
Very
each other.
clever. Yeah, very, very clever. How do we, because and this is one of my questions for you, in many ways, the state is stepping into the parent's role. You know, get your kids in daycare, you go back to work, the state will look after them, and all sorts of other ways in which the state is interfering into family life and parenting, etc., etc. How do we pry the state's fingers off of family life and recapture it for parents again?
I think that is a really tough question. Although, and I'm not one to be sort of party political here, but it is interesting to see Kemi Badenoch talking a lot about reducing the role of the state and reducing the tax burden by doing that. And I think That's a very popular message at the moment. People feel that the state is too intrusive and that they feel they're being overtaxed now.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but that's a huge agenda to discuss. How do you reduce the expenditure in the NHS? Um, how do you enable and empower parents to take over more responsibilities again?
But it all comes under a relational worldview. It's my job to take care of that person and raise that person. It's my job to look after my elderly parents and make sure that again, it's a whole complete transformation in the view of relational attitudes, really.
Yes, I remember looking at this another time because Germany has a law, it's in their constitution actually, that um, adult individuals are responsible to provide for their elderly parents. So, in your case, it would mean that you, under the German constitution, if you're in Germany, are responsible to financially provide for your parents in their old age. So, this 62-year-old goes to court, and it goes to the Supreme Court in Germany, saying, I never saw my parents. I hadn't seen my father since I was 2 years old. And now I'm being required to provide for him financially. This is unfair. He never gave me any time. Why should I now have to look after him in his old age? And the Supreme Court in Germany said, sorry, tough. That is the way it is.
Wow, I never knew that.
So, I think, but if you put those sort of constitutional provisions in, then you do incentivize parents if their own children have got to provide for them in their old age. You really do incentivize parents to take trouble over their children rather than thinking, well, when I get old, I don't need to worry about what I did with my kids, whether I had any time with them or not, because the state's going to pay up.
And so we spoke earlier on about the policy implications, and I suppose you've given us. I was going to ask what would your two main levers be, but you've given us. I mean, having discussed things further, what would you say your top two levers would be if a government were to come and do something? What would the top two things be?
Well, for marriage in particular, I think the couple tax allowance would be right at the top of the list because I just think marriage itself is key to so much else, um, and incentivizing people to get married and stay married financially, in the end, has so many benefits to children in particular and to society more widely. So I think I would put that right at the top. Um, and then probably some incentives to get relatives to live near each other. Because if you're very isolated, you're living in Milton Keynes, you've got, two or three kids, it gets pretty heavy if you have no relatives anywhere near to help out, no relatives no grandparents to whom you can say, look, please, could you pick up Jimmy from school this afternoon because I need to be late at work or I need to get to a dentist appointment, whatever it might be. You know, it's just it just makes life difficult. And incentivizing people to live near relatives. The Australians have a system of education whereby they expect their children to go to a nearby university
Hmm.
so they can live at home, so that the adult child isn't going away to university and then let's say we sent a child to university in Sheffield. We didn't, but supposing we did, the child then decides to settle in Sheffield because they developed a social network there. We are living in Cambridge, so when we're going to see the child,
Yeah.
but the critical moment of decision was when they went off to university.
Yeah. Interesting. Really
We
interesting.
subsidize and we make possible for children to do that by
Yeah.
providing all sorts of state grants and everything else to help them live in another city, and as well as paying the tuition fees, etc. I mean, there's lots of issues going on around this at the
Mm.
moment, but we're not incentivizing them to go to university nearby.
That's interesting. There you go. Another policy. You
It's
know,
another big policy area. How do you
yeah,
encourage the idea of roots and rootedness?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
it is something on which I wrote Cambridge papers and other things over the years,
yeah, yeah,
looking
yeah.
at those sorts of questions.
Yeah, fascinating. And I suppose the last thing I'll pick up with you, because you're a busy man, I even still, but the whole cultural, spiritual aspect of this. I mean, a lot of your work is very, very, and your books are very sort of secular based. These are things which are good for society. These are things which are good for corporations. You know, I think we mentioned at the beginning the idea that it's just business. Sorry, it doesn't matter if it ruins many lives. Well, actually, that's anathema in terms of we're human beings, and but then culturally, that seems to be the prevailing view. Are we going to make a lot of progress culturally without the spiritual aspect, do you think? Without the spiritual, there's a lot of people now who are saying, oh, yes, we think the Christian moral social ethic, the scaffolding is good for society, but we're not believers. Is that a thing? And can you can you persuade people culturally from a worldly point of view that the relational view is a good thing, or does it rest on some kind of spiritual faith element?
Well, I think you can definitely. I mean, part of the whole point of the developing that relational perspective was as an intermediate point towards faith, because ultimately, of course, the most important relationship that matters is the relationship we have with God, and the fact that God, as a relational being, incentivizes us and also demonstrates to us what that looks like through the life and death of Christ. And in marriage, indeed, wives obey your husbands. The, it says in Ephesians, but also it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So you have this balance of submission by the wife, but total um, self negation by the husband. I mean, it's a balance of responsibilities. Now, coming back to your point, I think that trying to encourage people to look at the world through a relational lens and to realize the importance and value of relationships is a very important step towards faith. I mean, what do you want on your gravestone? Coming back to where you started almost this conversation. Um, do you want it to say, he was CEO of a major corporation for 20 years or 10 years or something? Is that the greatest achievement? Or do you want it to say um, a faithful and loving husband, wife, um, grandparent, etc.,
Yeah, yeah,
parent, grandparent, etc.? Yes. So,
yeah,
do you? What do you want as your legacy? What do you want to be
yeah,
remembered for?
yeah, yeah, yeah. How will you measure your life? Absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
How will you measure
yeah,
your life?
yeah. I
So
love it.
I think
Yeah,
it's a very deep question, but I think most people, even the most secular, will want to be remembered for these relational things, even if it's outside the family as a faithful friend. They want to be remembered for those things. Those are the things ultimately that matter to them. And I think pointing that out and getting them to think through the implications of that and how we get to the point where we can deliver on that in our personal lives is a good starting point to people who don't have faith. Obviously, if people do have faith, and particularly if they have a Christian faith, then you have a mountain of material to appeal to in terms of what living rightly looks like and what sacrifice, personal sacrifice is worth, is the fact that personal sacrifice is so worth it. Jesus says, a person who loves gives up his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. So I'm giving up my life for you.
I love the phrase total self-negation earlier on in terms of the husband, and it's a key thing, isn't it? That an ideal husband's role should be that his life is dedicated to the betterment of his wife and to help her be the best woman she could be, and even up to the point of self-sacrifice, like Christ. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of us husbands who are thinking, "Oh, I'm not sure I've come up to the measure of that today." But if we did, what woman would then not want to be led by that kind of leadership? You know,
Yes, absolutely right.
you
That's
know.
exactly it. Yeah,
Yeah, it's quite
yeah.
something. And so I think the work you're doing, I hadn't discovered you, but I'm glad I have, and I've read lots of your stuff now, and I'm an absolute fan. So
Thank you.
fantastic, and I'm very, very grateful. And I hope in many other ways we'll have lots to do with each other in months and years to come, maybe.
I hope
But
so.
Dr. Michael Schluter, it's a joy to meet you and to introduce you to our supporters at the Coalition for Marriage. Thank you so much for your time.
No, I appreciate it very much, and I hope one or two people get round to reading, the R factor, particularly the R option, and the relational lens. Some of these books. Hope some people will have a chance to look at those books and reflect on it, and hopefully come back with questions and thoughts as well.
Good idea. Yeah, let's get the conversation going.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
no, it's been lovely, Tony. Great joy to spend time with you today. Bye for now.